So, one day I was on the Steam store when I stumbled upon something called Brotato. Looking at it, it appears to be just another Vampire Survivor knockoff, but it was on sale, so I decided to give it a go. If you don't know what a survival roguelike is, it's a pretty simple concept. It's basically a combination of passive games like Cookie Clicker and the like, with more active games that you typically play. You walk your character around and automatically attack enemies as they approach. As you kill enemies, you get EXP and material, which you can buy items and weapons with. Now, I'm sure most people watching this have either played or at least heard of Vampire Survivor. I'd say it's the first survival roguelike that really popped off. While simplistic, it is definitely extremely addicting and worth playing. However, pretty much every issue with gameplay that you'd have with Vampire Survivor is solved in Brotato, and for multiple reasons I would consider Brotato to be the next evolution of these kinds of games. So, allow me to show you every reason why Brotato is the perfect survival roguelike. For the most part, I'll be comparing Brotato to Vampire Survivor, as that's definitely the most popular game in this genre, and it's the one I'm most familiar with. So, let's go over some of the issues with Vampire Survivor and the ways that Brotato works around them. First off, let's look at the enemies in each game. In 1, the enemies are pretty much all the exact same, some having more movement speed and some having more health. For the vast majority of enemies in Vampire Survivor, they just run at you to damage you. In Brotato, there's a vast variety of different enemy types, each with their own gimmicks and quirks. First, you have your standard enemies, just like Vampire Survivor. Then, you have your spitters, who will run away from the player and actually shoot projectiles. You also have chargers, who will wait a few seconds before blasting towards you. Then there's pursuers, who are incredibly tanky and get faster with each second, meaning you have to take them out as soon as possible. You also have spawners, who, when killed, will spawn 3 other enemies that will walk around and shoot projectiles at random. You have all of these different enemies and many more. Having a large amount of different enemies varies the runs greatly, as some characters / builds will handle different groups of enemies better than another. This is also the main reason why this game is so addicting. It is actually genuinely difficult on higher difficulties, meaning you have to really understand how to deal with different enemies and what the best stats are for each character. Speaking of characters, let's talk about the immense variety of characters in Brotato. In Vampire Survivor, for the most part, each character is quite similar to one another. The most variety you'll get is that they have a different starting weapon, and some may have a unique ability such as spawning an additional projectile. And maybe their stats will level up differently when they gain EXP. Meanwhile, in Brotato, each character plays entirely different from one another. For instance, you could have a character whose main stat is speed, where he actively gets stronger the more speed he gets, and if he stops moving, he'll lose all of his armor, essentially meaning you'll die in one hit if you're not continuously moving. You also have a pacifist character who gains EXP and materials based on the amount of enemies alive at the end of a round. There's characters who are only able to equip one weapon with massively increased attack speed, characters who can wield 12 weapons at once, characters who deal damage every time they're healed, characters who only have the ability to damage enemies by running into them. The list goes on and on for unique characters. The most important thing is that each of them violently changes the way in which you play the game. While there are some similarities in some characters, such as some group of characters may only use ranged weapons, they all still have their own unique quirks that makes each and every one of them fun to play. Not only that, but all of the characters are relatively easy to unlock, and the game actually tells you how to unlock each one of them. This makes it so that you aren't overwhelmed by the amount of characters at the beginning, while allowing you to unlock them whenever you please. Not to mention, there's great mod support for the game, so if you somehow do get bored of all the different characters in the base game, you'll have hundreds of other characters you can get from mods. There really is no limit to all the different kinds of characters you can have in a game like this, due to the extreme flexibility that is offered to you when it comes to stats and how you grow them. Let's look more into stat growth while we're on the topic. In Vampire Survivor, you eventually get to the point where there's no way to get stronger, and there's really no way to get killed either, leading to you just standing there waiting for the timer to go. In this game, no matter how strong you are, you always need to pay attention, and there is no limit on stat growth or levels. You can purchase as many items as you want and level up as much as you can. The items are implemented in a really smart way too, most items having some kind of drawback so you aren't just purchasing every item every time you go into the shop. This kind of build variety is simply not available in most other games in this genre, as there's typically some kind of limit, and often even before you hit this limit you've already reached the point where you're so strong you're at no risk of dying. Let's also talk about the different stages that you see in Brotato. There's only one. The reason for this is because there's truly no need for different stages, as the focus of the game is on the enemies and the different builds that you can do. I believe the main reason that Vampire Survivor has so many stages is due to the fact that the game is inherently not that varied between runs. So they introduce different stages to give the game more replayability, which is nice at first, but once you realize it's all more or less the same, it kinda loses its charm. Looking at the difficulty of the game, I can honestly say that Brotato has a decent learning curve, specifically when it comes to level 5 difficulty. I remember being absolutely hard stuck on a character for the longest time, and it required me to really learn the game, learn how to kite different kinds of bosses that you encounter in the game, and learn how to properly build when it comes to higher difficulties like that, where enemies are a lot tankier and deal a lot more damage. This kind of difficulty curve doesn't really exist in most other games in this genre. I can't say Vampire Survivors takes longer than maybe 10 runs to really get the hang of it and understand the flow of the game, and from there most of the difficulty comes from if you don't get the items you're looking for, which is another problem that's solved in Brotato. While randomness is inherently going to be a part of any kind of game like this, and honestly that's part of what makes them fun, Brotato makes it very easy to adapt to what's being offered to you. Whenever you level up, you're given 4 different options of stats that you can increase, and I can honestly say it's pretty rare for me to feel the need to reroll because all of the stats are worthless to me. Pretty much the only time I would reroll my options was when I was looking for a higher rarity of upgrades. There really is no stat that could truly be considered pointless or worthless on most of my runs, besides maybe Harvest. Not to mention, pretty much every weapon has its uses and purpose in the game, as most weapons have unique abilities on them, such as ethereal weapons, which will permanently increase a specific stat by 1 every some number of enemies killed, or the wrench, which will summon a turret, perfect if you're going an engineer build. When you also consider the wide variety of characters and playstyles, each weapon has its place in the game, and it would be extremely difficult to label any of them as just filler weapons. While I'm on the topic of RNG, I should also mention that the devs were very generous when it comes to the weapons that appear in the shop. You have a much higher chance of seeing ranged weapons if the first weapon you picked at the start of the run was ranged, and vice versa for melee weapons. In cases where a character is unable to equip some type of weapon, they won't even show up in his shop. They managed to keep the variety and enjoyment of RNG in the game without making it overwhelming with the large size of weapons, which is something that should absolutely be applauded. It's incredibly clear just by playing that a lot of thought has gone into each character, their abilities, and the different weapons and items in the game. You can tell that the designer of some of these characters decided something like, I want to make a pacifist character, and found stats that made that kind of character actually playable. I really admire the craftsmanship that went into each character and the way that they made each one strong and enjoyable to play. While there certainly are some characters that are stronger or weaker than others, there's no doubt in my mind that each one of them can be completed on the hardest difficulty with enough determination. Taking a look at the different kinds of bosses in each game, you can tell that there was a lot more thought and care that went into Brotato's design compared to Vampire Survivors. In Vampire Survivors, only a few bosses have unique mechanics, each one pretty much boiling down to just charging at the player character and attempting to deal damage through touch. Brotato made sure that each boss has a unique mechanic to them, such as this one who has a circle of bullets constantly going around him, or this one who will charge at you, making him extremely difficult to deal with if you don't have enough points in movement speed. Each boss has a unique attack pattern that is memorable, and once you recognize that pattern, you'll become much better at the game and be able to easily dodge all of their abilities. I absolutely love that they more or less turned this genre into something of a bullet hell at certain points, which can really get your heart pumping if you've been trying to win on a certain character and you can't take any more damage. The movement also just feels much more smooth in this game compared to Vampire Survivor. Often, there's just enough of a gap between enemies that you can slip by, making the movement feel extremely satisfying and rewarding when you narrowly escape death. In Vampire Survivor, the majority of the time when you die is because there's a literal wall of enemies coming towards you that you simply can't avoid because you don't have enough damage. You have the ability to survive in Brotato even if you don't have the damage to deal with the enemies, giving you a chance at the next drop to upgrade your weapons and hopefully get enough damage to deal with the next wave better. I believe the reason for this is because the devs were very smart with the amount of enemies they put given the space that you have to run around in. I often see some of the enemies disappearing when new ones spawn in, showing that there is some kind of cap on how many enemies can be on the field at one time. Another fantastic design decision from the creators, showing that they really playtested this game and tried their best. Now, I don't want this to come off as me saying Vampire Survivors is a trash game or anything. Vampire Survivors is absolutely a great game and worth the money. It can be just as addicting as Brotato, assuming you haven't played Brotato before. I absolutely believe that the devs had a strong influence from Vampire Survivors, saw the issues that it had, and improved upon them. Without Vampire Survivors, you simply wouldn't have a Brotato. With that said, I doubt I could ever go back and enjoy Vampire Survivors, and I doubt I'd find another game in this genre that scratches that itch quite like this one. On top of that, this is the perfect game to play on the Steam Deck. If you have one, I cannot recommend it enough. Just make sure you don't play in the bathroom, as you'll end up sitting in there for about 3 hours. With all that said, if you're considering purchasing the game, absolutely do it. If you enjoy these kind of games and can appreciate a bit of difficulty, you'll have an absolute blast. For only $5, you would struggle to find another time waster that's quite as fun as this one.